relatively mature in the SOA services world to have all kinds of really great security services that people can use because they recognize that building all these yourselves was insane. But then you go to the web world and they have no security standards, which is kind of interesting. It seems like, well, this one was first and this was next. Your maturity should have gone from older to newer, but that's kind of where they are. 5 minutes? Okay. So in an ideal world, you wouldn't have a security sprint because you have so much significant infrastructure that you wouldn't even conceive of pausing for 3 to 4 weeks to focus just on security. But when you're new and you don't have a lot of infrastructure and you got to build a security component, maybe this makes sense. You got to build several components together, or you decide to weave it in. It's all based on your prioritization scheme with respect to your stories, both security and functional stories, right? So then we think some security reviews are in order, right? Now we got to figure out how do we do reviews in a way that's not a bomb in the middle of the process that disrupts everything, right? So having a security tester that is involved as you go a little bit, if you can, is good. A periodic, certainly with the threat modeling and the security requirements, you're sort of doing some upfront planning. Again, it's not the heavyweight planning of waterfall where you're going, let's get every requirement out to the endless detail. We want to get the buckets of security requirements, prioritize those, and then when we get to that bucket, then we figure out the details in that particular sprint. So, and then of course doing code review and pen testing at the end, makes sense because it's, it's not in the middle. Again, it's going to obviously affect deployment, right? I can't conceive of a way that you can imagine doing security and having zero impact on schedule. I mean, it's just impossible, right? But we want to figure out a way so we're not inserting 5 extra days out of every 3-week sprint or something, because that is going to make the whole process 25% longer, right? So we want to make it 5% longer or something by weaving it through and then understanding we have a gating effort at the end. And if we've been doing it all along the way, then that review at the end is going to be hopefully perfunctory, right? We just go, yeah, we're just verifying that we did all the good stuff we're supposed to do, and they'll find stuff that always happens, but hopefully it's not major, and then they can take some risk analysis and go, well, we got some issues, but schedule's important and whatever, so we might decide to go live, and then we're going to fix that in the next release or whatever. So that's just the way you do risk management anyway, right? So these are just a couple ways to weave it in without being disruptive. So a simple example that it was an observation that came to us recently. We were working on an application, and it's got a very complicated access control policy. We're envisioning like 4 or 5 different roles, and some of them are hierarchical, and some of them are independent. Like you have different kinds of administrators, different kinds of users, and we're building the application, and the developer's like, well, I don't want to get started building this app until I understand the policy, because that policy could massively affect how I build the application. And I'm like, that doesn't sound right, because I want to do Agile, right? I want to get the app in front of the customer, get them to see it, like it, decide what's in, drop things that they don't like, add new things, change all kinds of stuff, and try to figure out the policy for all that stuff that we haven't built yet is a little premature. So what we said was, look, let's put the security checks for access control in the app as we build it. So when you put a button on the screen that might be optional based on privileges, make sure you check to sure if that button should be displayed. When the function is actually invoked, whether it's the page or the business function, check to see if they're authorized. But then your policy says all allowed, right? So you can just build your app, get the functionality done, and then at some point later on, you can either partially figure out your policy or completely figure out your policy at the end. So you might say, well, we're kind of halfway through and the functionality is stabilizing, and we want to make sure we got all access control in there right. So let's figure out the policy for the 2 or 3 normal user roles, put that into the policy store, and then see what happens. Just see if the buttons show up or not that they're supposed to, and test to see if things are good on. And that's when you're actually going to implement your security tests that verify that you got your security checks in the right place. Because you can't build those tests beforehand, because if they're always allowing access when it's like a user trying an admin function, that test will clearly break. So here's your chance to configure your policy and then build your test cases to verify that you're actually doing what you're doing, but you haven't done a massive re-architecture of your app to build access control in. And this supports both declarative and programmatic access control, right? So if you're using something like SiteMinder or any other filter that protects pages based on roles, you can implement that policy later. And then you could also use, hopefully you're using the same policy to drive how you do access control inside of your application. So in summary, I really think you could do this. It's going to require a lot of structure in an agile way. I mean, I'm not, again, not heavyweight. You're going to need to build these artifacts that makes you faster. So I already talked about standard components and coding guidelines and training and security experts being helpful. But all the other processes that you're doing that are related to security, you need artifacts for too. So threat modeling, you need a process for how to do threat modeling. You need some example threat models, some example stakeholder security stories. And in fact, if you're building similar kinds of apps, and web apps tend to be very similar to each other, as you start building a library of stakeholder security stories and the threat